Those warriors who caused the Bronze Age collapse are said to have an unknown and mysterious origin, but it is obvious to those with the eyes to see where they truly come from. The Bronze Age collapse happened 1200 to 1150 BCE, and it was more than just a mere destruction of kingdoms and cities. It was a cataclysmic reset, a reckoning where the weak fell and the strong rose. For centuries, the Near East empires, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, and the Babylonians, had built vast bureaucracies and lived off of a slave population and centralized temple economies, growing dependent on merchants, scribes, and tax collectors rather than warlords and kings who ruled by the sword. The Hyperborean storm came in the form of the Sea Peoples and the Dorian invaders, shattering the old world. And what emerged from this collapse was not ruin, but a renewal, a shift from the bureaucratic temple economies to a society led by warrior elites. This was a true civilizational reset where strength and hierarchy replaced the stagnation of merchant rule. Let us first take a look at the Canaanite civilization, a merchant empire built off of black magic and human sacrifice. Canaan, located in the Levant, was one of the most commercially vibrant and wealthy regions of the Bronze Age. Unlike the Mycenaeans or the Hittites, who built power through war and conquest, the Canaanites were primarily traders, artisans, slavers, and city state rulers who relied on commerce rather than military strength. In 1200 BC, Canaan was a collection of loosely connected city states ruled by merchant elites and priestly overlords. The region thrived economically, but its power structure was weak and fragmented, making it vulnerable to external attack. Canaan's position between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia made it a prime target during the Bronze Age collapse. The Canaanite elites, obsessed with magic, trade, and wealth, failed to prepare for war, and when the Sea Peoples came, they had no real means of defense. They had fragile treaties with the Egyptians and the Hittites, but when both these empires collapsed, Canaan was left exposed. Instead of uniting, their merchant elites remained divided, making them easy prey for invasion. The Sea People's invasion of Canaan was a multi-phase destruction, targeting the major trade hubs and coastal cities first before moving inland. The destruction of Canaan was not a single event, but a series of attacks and conquests that permanently altered the region. The first phase of the Sea People's assault targeted Canaan's richest maritime cities, where there was heavily invested in trade and the production of Tyrian purple. Ugarit was one of the most wealthiest cities in the ancient world, a hub of luxury and gold and ivory. When the Sea Peoples attacked, the defenses failed almost instantly. Mercenaries hired to defend the city either fled or simply joined the invaders. The entire city was burned to the ground, and the once great trading networks collapsed overnight. Letters in the Ugarit's ruins describe a desperate plea for help from the Hittites and the Egyptians, but no one came to help. Other cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza were collapsed as well. The Philistines, a faction of the Kurgan Sea Peoples, took control of these cities and settled permanently. The invasion completely displaced the Canaanite population, and Philistine warriors replaced the old merchant elites. After the coastal destruction, the inland Canaanite cities fell into chaos, with their trade networks destroyed. Famine and economic collapse spread throughout Canaan. Hazar was one of the largest and most fortified Canaanite cities located in northern Canaan. Despite its massive walls, Hazar was abandoned and burned. Evidence shows violent destruction, including beheaded statues of Canaanite gods, an affront to the Kurgan invaders, were found scattered about. Smaller cities like Jericho were also abandoned. Many cities became ghost towns, and that civilization never recovered from the destruction. In fact, it was the end of an entire civilization. The Philistines took over, and the warrior elites replaced the merchants. They settled Canaan and completely replaced these old Canaanite rulers. They established a new order, ruling the region with strength rather than trade. Old Canaanite gods were abandoned or desecrated. Their temples were looted and destroyed, and their statues were smashed. The Philistines introduced the Kurgan deities from the north, emphasizing martial prowess over wealth and trade. The cultural landscape in the region shifted from a merchant-based economy to a warrior-dominated one. Another civilizational reset that took place was one of peoples who did themselves descend from the Kurgans, but they grew bloated, weak, and corrupt. The Mycenaean civilization was the dominant power of Bronze Age Greece. They were descendants of Kurgan warrior kings known for their brutality, honor-based warrior culture, and expansionist tendencies. They were the Achaeans of Homeric legend, a civilization that sacked Troy and warred with each other in endless power struggles. And their peak, the Mycenaean Greeks were not traders or scribes, they were raiders, conquerors. Their society was based on a military aristocracy where elites ruled from fortified citadels. They took over Crete and the Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE. They launched piracy raids across the Aegean, attacking Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Canaanite ports. They are believed to have attacked Troy in the war that was later immortalized in the Iliad. Each kingdom was ruled by a Wanax, a warrior king, who gained power through battle and prowess. The Mycenaean elite lived off of conquest, tribute, and plunder, rather than taxation and trade. By 1300 to 1200 BC, they began to shift from a war-based economy to a bureaucratic, palace-controlled state. The old warrior kings had turned into administrators, and their focus shifted from conquest to governance and trade. Instead of continuing their warrior traditions, Mycenaean kings started centralizing power through taxation and administration. The palaces became centers of economic control, where scribes managed resources, taxes, and production. Mycenaean rulers became more focused on wealth accumulation, hoarding through trade rather than military expansion. The old warrior nobility was beginning to be replaced by bureaucrats and merchants. Instead of launching raids and campaigns, they began to build massive defensive walls, turtling and growing in fear of invasion. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns were built to protect against enemies. But walls are a sign of a civilization in decline. Instead of fighting, they were preparing to hide behind their fortresses. And now, for their armaments, they relied on imports of copper and tin to make bronze from Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus. Their wealth was now tied to diplomatic treaties and commerce, not military power. By the time the sea people gigachads arrived, the Mycenaeans were already weakened, divided, and reliant on bureaucratic rule rather than warrior traditions. When the true storm came, they had no answer. The first wave of attacks hit the islands of coastal Mycenaean cities, crippling their trade networks. Crete, Rhodes, and the Aegean Islands were almost the first to fall. This cut off Mycenaean access to foreign resources. The navy was either destroyed or insufficient, leaving the cities exposed to land based invasion. Pylos, one of the wealthiest Mycenaean cities, was completely destroyed by fire. Evidence shows that its warriors were unprepared. Some tablets found in the ruins record last minute defensive measures. We cannot get out. They are coming. The palace was burned and the city was abandoned. The great city of Mycenae fell around 1190 BC when its mighty Cyclopean walls failed to stop the invaders. Tyrenes, another Mycenaean stronghold, was also vanquished. The ruling class was slaughtered, and many survivors fled to the mountains or joined the ranks of the invaders, bending the knee. Within a single generation, Mycenaean Greece was erased. All major cities, except for a few smaller settlements, were destroyed. And who were these attackers? The Dorian invasion, the return of the Hyperborean bloodline. New warriors swept down from the north. The Dorians. These Dorians were hardened warriors who destroyed what was left of the decadent Mycenaeans. They rejected the bureaucratic palace system and restored the decentralized, warlike culture. The old scribal and merchant class was vanquished, and now a society ruled by tribal warlords, setting the foundation for Spartan militarism, arrived. It is said that this was the start of a dark age, but always remember it's inversed in history. The dark ages were always the light. Next on the docket is the new kingdom of Egypt. In 1200 BC, Egypt was still one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. The new kingdom had seen the rise of great warrior pharaohs like Amenhotep and Ramses II, who expanded Egyptian control over Canaan, Nubia, and parts of Syria. But by the time of Ramses III, Egypt had stopped being a warrior empire and had become a theocracy led by black magic priests and priestesses, bureaucrats, merchants, and mercenaries rather than native warriors. The pharaoh was no longer a warrior king, but a figurehead under the control of the priesthood. Egypt was still mighty on paper, but beneath the surface, corruption, economic decline, and over resilience on foreign mercenaries had weakened its core. When the Sea Peoples came, Egypt barely survived. One of the problems was that the priesthood had become more powerful than the pharaoh. A pattern has been emerging amongst these cases. The Amun priesthood in Thebes controlled huge amounts of land, resources, and labor, weakening the power of the pharaoh. The temples were exempt from taxation, making them richer while draining the state of revenue. The pharaohs had essentially become puppets of a priestly class, focusing more on religious duties than military campaigns. Instead of producing warriors, Egypt's wealth was used to build temples, fund rituals, and sustain the black magic priesthood. Unlike the past, when the pharaohs commanded Egyptian born warriors, the army was now dependent on mercenaries from Libya, Nubia, and the Levant. Mercenaries fight for gold, not honor or homeland. They were unreliable and often turned against their employers in times of crisis. When the Sea Peoples invaded, many of these mercenaries either deserted or fought with no loyalty. The Palace temple economy and the priest class was draining resources due to overtaxation and corruption. Egyptian trade networks with Canaan, Cyprus, and the Mycenaeans collapsed, leading to a shortage of key resources like copper and tin, which made producing bronze extremely difficult. Grain shortages led to famine, and internal unrest and worker strikes were increasing, showing signs of a civilizational breakdown. The Sea Peoples had already destroyed the Canaanites and Mycenaeans by the time they reached Egypt around 1177 BC. Unlike the weakened cities they had burned in Anatolian Greece, Egypt was still powerful, but it was no longer war ready. As Sea Peoples first launched their naval attacks on the Nile Delta, a tactic that would echo in history with their Viking cousins, raiding Egyptian ports and disrupting grain shipments. Egypt lost control of the coast and entire towns were burned. Without a strong navy, Egypt could not stop the Sea People. The Egyptian chariots had some success against the invaders, but ultimately failed to stop the Sea Peoples from continuing their push south. Finally, the Sea Peoples launched a full scale invasion into the Nile Delta, hoping to settle permanently in Egypt, just as they'd done in Canaan. Ramses III assembled the full force of the Egyptian military, chariots, archers, and infantry to face the invasion. The Egyptians set traps in the river, luring the Sea Peoples into a coastal ambush. Egyptians were victorious, but at a heavy cost. Egypt had permanently lost its empire in Canaan as the Philistines took control over the region. Egyptian influence in the Near East collapsed, leaving the Assyrians, Israelites, and later Persians to take over the region. Egypt would never again control the Levant as it had during its golden age. The war had bankrupted Egypt, and the internal economy collapsed. Famine spread, shipments were disrupted, and the temple priests tightened their noose around the pharaoh's neck. Despite surviving the onslaught of the Sea Peoples, Egypt was never the same, delving into a fragmented theocracy. Other civilizations like the Cypriots, the Minoans, and the Hittites also fell in the wake of the Sea Peoples, who were not just invaders, they were enforcers of a new order. The Bronze Age had been ruled by decadent and weak kings who sat behind walls, collected taxes, and issued decrees. The New Age belonged to those who had the will to conquer. The old palace bureaucracies were gone. Cities were no longer ruled by temple priestesses, but by warrior kings. The old merchants and scribes had been all but wiped out. And now this event is being downplayed and covered up because, once again, roving war bands from the north who inherited the Hyperborean Kurgan bloodline swept across the land and reshaped civilization. And even modern historians are going so far as to say that this was due to climate change and internal strife. It had nothing to do with an outside force. But with those who have the eyes to see, it is clear what actually occurred.